Yes, hi everyone. This is Martin Willis, your host for the evening, and I'm really excited about tonight's guest. I read her book. She is an exceptional writer. I really enjoyed reading this. The name of the book is called Surviving Death: A Journalist Investigates Evidence for the Afterlife. Now, I know of Leslie from many years ago. She wrote an excellent book on UFOs called UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. And a lot of people that I've talked to over the years said that is the go-to book for the real story on some amazing encounters. And lots and lots of people love that book. And this one is another great, great book. I'm so excited to have her on. Welcome to the show, Leslie.
Hi, Martin. It's great to be here.
Yes. So this book, what inspired you to write it? I mean, you've had some personal experiences.
Yeah, but most of those didn't happen I've had things over my life, but the main experiences I talk about in the book didn't happen until after I started it. So that wasn't the reason that I wrote the book, but this is just a topic I've been interested in for a long time. And even though I was focused primarily on UFOs, I have always been sort of researching this one in the background.
Yeah, I don't.
And yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying I don't blame you. It is a fascinating topic.
Yeah, and my friend Bud Hopkins died in 2011, and being there, being present at the moment he died, certainly was a catalyst for me to want to probe deeper into the mystery of what actually happens, because it's quite mind-boggling when you're right there for it.
Yes.
And it's just sort of became a natural kind of evolution for me, having sort of felt like I've said everything I could say about UFOs in that one book. So I was ready to move into this other realm, which is a much more complicated and bigger kind of thing to deal with and more difficult also for
Oh,
me anyway.
absolutely. And there's so many things that are just hard to swallow that, people have these accounts. And one of the things that has really, really fascinated me is to hear the topics of near-death experiences. And I do want to talk quite a bit about that. And also, the book starts out with childhood, like past life memories. Before we get into all that, I would like to just talk quickly about a couple of reasons why I'm kind of fascinated in this topic. And
Sure.
one of them was I was really, really close to my grandmother, very, very close. And she died fairly young in her early 60s of cancer. And I was really upset about it as she was dying, and I couldn't leave. I was in school. My father went down. She lived in Georgia. And I
Hmm.
always said all the good that came out of our family started with her because she was just such a wonderful person. And so I was really concerned and worried and upset and all that. I remember during school and all that. Well, that night, the night of her funeral, I had a dream that was one of the most realistic dreams I've ever had in my life. And I could even like feel air moving in the dream. I know it's kind of strange. Now, my grandmother always wore her hair up. I never saw her with her hair down ever. And so I saw her standing there with her hair down and like moving in the wind, wearing a pink gown with a pearl necklace. And, it was just so clear. And she says, "Don't worry about me. I'm okay. Everything's okay. Stop worrying. I'm fine." And then she kind of faded away, and that was it. So my father came back from Georgia, and it's the only time I ever saw him turn completely white. I described the dream to him, and he goes, "My God, she had her hair down, was in a pink gown, and was wearing her pearl necklace." I
Wow, well,
never
there
saw
you
her wear
go.
the pearl necklace either.
There you go.
So anyway, that's what has me fascinated in this topic.
Yeah, and there's so many people, Martin, that have experiences like that, where and there's a section in my book that deals with the end of life experiences, and also with after death communications, which sort of is what you're talking about. But people that have these vivid dreams, and especially that one, which is really evidential because you didn't know what she was wearing. So how else are you going to interpret that? I assume you're interpreting that as a visit from her.
I That's kind of what I've thought, and I kind of put it away, over the years. And but if the topic ever comes up, I'll say, "Hey, look, I had a dream once." I mean, and I have heard. It made me look into it I was only like 14 or something at the time, but it made me
Hmm.
look into
Right.
it. And I remember going to the library and reading about where someone saw their uncle's hat on, it was some book about it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone
Mm-hmm.
saw their uncle's hat on the bed, and next thing you know, they find out their uncle had just died. There's stories like that.
There are a lot of them like that, and so I guess it's really meaningful to the recipient.
Right.
And
Yeah.
really meaningful. And why not allow yourself to have that experience as being a visit from her? I mean, there's no way you can ever prove it. But the fact that, she looked like in a way that you couldn't have imagined and it was accurate. And
Yeah.
also, those dreams tend to be people say that they're more vivid and more realistic. That sometimes they say even than waking consciousness is.
Yeah. I mean,
The
I'm
same
telling you,
way
it
they talk
was,
about NDEs. I'm sure that's, you wouldn't
yeah,
remember it today if it was just a regular dream. I don't think you'd remember it.
it was,
So,
it was probably in my experience the most vivid dream I ever had. You
so
know?
there you go.
Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful, wonderful story.
Yeah. Yeah. And one other story I'm going to say, and then that's it. And the rest of the show is yours. And that is my sister's sister-in-law had ovarian cancer and died fairly young. And it was less than 2 weeks after 9/11. And
Mm-hmm.
she started with her daughter was there, and then her sister was there. I guess her sister was there at the very end. Well, she was talking to people that weren't there, as if they were there. Now I understand there could be something to do with, maybe a change in the brain chemistry and all that. But then she kept saying, look at all those people trying to get on the train. And I just thought that was such an interesting thing to say. It was, like I said, it was just right after 9/11. Okay, that's it for stories for me.
No, but it's true. I mean, there's a chapter in my book that's written by Peter Fenwick. I don't know if you read that, but he's this wonderful, elderly, gentlemanly British psychologist, neuropsychologist who's been studying end-of-life experiences for decades. And one of the things he writes about is people just before they die seeing visions of dead relatives, basically visiting them
Yeah.
and coming back, reaching out their arms towards them, things like that, and feeling that those people are there to help assist them with their journeys. Now, whether you want to say that's brain chemistry or not, I don't think there's any way that anybody's been able to explain it that way, because we're talking about people here that are conscious. They're not on, we're dealing with conscious dying here, not people who are on a lot of medications or anything. And it just happens all the time. So it's
Hmm.
certainly suggestive that the possibility that they are connecting with some other realm, which is a similar realm to where people go when they have NDEs or other kinds of experiences. They all kind of have similar qualities.
Right,
So,
right.
that's what I find so interesting is that different areas of research tend to reinforce each other. And that's what I tried to show in my book, was how everything's interconnected, all these different areas of research into these things.
Right, right. Now, the childhood past life memories. Now, usually they start, according to your book, they usually start fairly young, like in the 2 or 3 year old or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the one you had about James Linginger, I'm not sure, that's kind of how you pronounce his name?
Leininger. Yeah. Yeah.
That, can you talk about that? That's such a fascinating story, and all the things that were confirmed memories, I guess you would call them.
Yeah, I mean, what makes these cases evidential is when their memories can be confirmed, right? Because otherwise you have no idea if what they're remembering is accurate or not. But in the case of James, and there are many other cases like this, he was literally not even 2 when he started to talk about his memories, and he was just learning to talk. And, it would take me too long to tell the whole story, but he basically had these nightmares, consistent nightmares, in which he was reliving a death of being shot down in an airplane, and he was absolutely terrified and screaming, and his parents couldn't understand what was going on. And then at first he wasn't talking, and then a little later he started to say airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out, over and over again. He was obsessed with toy airplanes. He knew a lot about airplanes. He had information that he couldn't possibly have known about different models of airplanes, how to maintain them. And over a period of time, he told his parents that this little man in the plane was named James. And he said that it got shot in the front of the plane. He was shot by the Japanese. He talked about the name of the type of plane he flew, the name of the aircraft carrier that he flew off of in World War II, the full name of his best friend, who eventually was how his dad was able to find who that person was. It's a long story, but the gist of it, and he also talked about where he was shot down. And these were all facts that a 2-year-old had never been exposed to, that he certainly hadn't been exposed to. And through that information, his dad, who was determined to prove James wrong because he didn't believe that this was possible, he was eventually able to find out that there was a person who fit the very description, all the points that James had given, and his name was James. And the other thing that happened was James used to make a lot of drawings of this plane being shot down, and he would sign them James 3. And his parents they'd say, "Why do you write James 3?" And he'd say, "Because I'm the third James." Well, the person that he was talking about was James Houston Jr., which meant that James was the third James in the lineage. And so everything he said was able to be traced to this one person, and everything fit. And they were so specific that nobody had any doubts that this was the person little James was talking about. And he was a World War II pilot who died in 1945 and was shot down exactly the way James described it. James also met James Houston Jr.'s sister, who was 84 at the time, and she was absolutely convinced that little James was her brother reincarnated because he was able to tell her so many specific things about their childhood and their home life and all these kinds of stuff that James couldn't possibly have known. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Yeah,
there's more detail in the book, of course. But.
Yes. Oh, yes. It was really amazing. And then they actually put closure to it by actually going out on a boat and where he was actually shot down. And he sobbed and sobbed and sobbed.
You're right. Really a touching story. He was 8 years old at that time. Yeah, they went right to the spot where the plane went down because they had a map that his dad was able to find through all the records that he was able to find. And they did this ceremony. Yeah, and James just had this kind of cathartic experience of sobbing and saying goodbye. He saluted and said goodbye to James Houston Jr. and kind of moved on with his life after that.
Now, you met him when he was 18.
I met him when he was 18. It was very internalized for him. I mean, that's the thing. It was so emotional and so internalized that it's hard to imagine that it's just with some kind of psychic perception that he was having about this person. He really felt, as far as he was concerned, he was that person.
And how does someone move on and have a normal life after something like that?
Well, I mean, what usually happens is the kids forget between starting around 5 or 6. They tend to forget all these things and they just go to school and and that happened to James Leininger too. I mean, even though he was 8 when he had that kind of catharsis, he had really started to forget about the memories themselves. And he was a very normal kid. So, even though after the nightmares stopped, I mean, that was really, really difficult. But eventually those stopped and he just is a normal kid and he did extremely well in school and he's very well adjusted. And, and there are a lot of cases on record at the University of Virginia that are similar to this. They have a big database of cases they've been investigating for many decades. And the norm is that the child does forget about it after, usually when they start to go to school, they get more socialized, they get more involved in the outside world. And but lots of times they need to have some kind of an experience to sort of heal them, which might mean meeting the previous family or going back to the home from the previous life or something that kind of brings them some kind of closure to the whole thing.
Now, how would science approach looking at this? And, you said there was a study at the university, a lot of documented cases. How does science look at something like this? And, they always try to come up with a solution.
Yeah, and I don't know what you mean when you say science, but the people at the University of Virginia who have been studying this are the main pioneer for this work was a psychiatrist. His name was Ian Stevenson, and he spent decades and decades studying it. He died in 2007, and now there's a child psychiatrist who has sort of taken on Ian Stevenson's work. His name's Jim Tucker, and he wrote a chapter in my book actually about some of the cases from around the world. So I guess they're not science. I mean, when you might be talking about the skeptics, how do they handle it?
Well,
and
we'll
when you say
get into
science,
that.
I don't think nobody can explain it. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody can. But the people who have studied it, these 2 psychiatrists that I referenced, I mean, they think that the child most likely was reborn because they can't think of any other way of explaining it. But you can't prove that. But it's very hard to explain it, and that's the problem.
Right, right. So the when someone has this type of experience, and do you know how long, like going back, how far the earliest cases were of something like this in history? Did you
I
look into that at all?
don't. Well,
Yeah.
I know that, I mean, there are cases on file from Ian Stevenson, certainly back in the 50s, 60s. I mean, he studied these for so long, but I don't think there was anybody systematically studying them before him. So, there's probably isolated accounts of them in various places, but I've never seen, the kind of documentation prior to that was provided through this one man who went around the world and just documented these cases. So
Now,
I couldn't answer that.
okay, I told a relative as much of the story as I could about James again, about the airplane and all the different things. And he looked at me and he said, well, obviously the whole thing is a fabrication. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, the parents, everything, it's a fabrication. That's the easiest answer. That was
Yeah,
exactly
well,
his. And
I
so
know.
what do you say to someone that just comes out and just already has their mind made up?
Well, first of all, I would ask them if they'd read the case. Have they read either my book or other accounts, Jim Tucker's book? So if he hasn't read it, I don't think he has a right to make that determination. If he has read it, I would ask him, given the circumstances that he's aware. And here's the thing. I mean, the cases that are most important are the ones in which a record was made of what the child said before the parents or anybody had any idea who the previous person was. So that there's no way you could say after the fact they changed what the child had said to match the previous person. But I mean, if they want to say the whole thing was faked, it's just, to me, it's inconceivable. To Jim Tucker, it's inconceivable because you have to know the case, you have to know the family. They don't get anything out of this. This was a nightmare for them. I mean,
Right.
you can't get a 2-year-old to fake nightmares. You can't get
Yes.
a 2-year-old to fake talking about the name of the aircraft carrier that he flew off of in World War II, and you're sitting there and it comes out of his mouth. A lot of this stuff's recorded. I mean, you could say, oh, he didn't really say it. The parents are lying.
That's basically what
But
he was saying.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of it was recorded,
Yeah.
and you'd have to ask what they would get out of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, anyway, I think that that's a longer discussion. I mean, I'd be happy to discuss that hypothesis with somebody who had actually studied the case first, somebody who had met the parents, met the family, and studied the case. And
Hmm.
debunkers tend to just come up with things like that. The UFO people do too,
Right.
when they haven't even done their homework.
Yes. Yes. Oh, I'm familiar
So,
with all that. I know
yeah.
exactly what you're saying. And now, when you say there's a lot of cases, how many cases would you think are, and a lot of them were in India. Did I read that in your
Yeah, I
book?
mean, a lot of them were in India, Asian countries, Sri Lanka, places, Burma, places in which the culture accepts the reality or the belief system of reincarnation. So they talk about it more. And it's just
Mhm.
part of the culture. And I think that's why these two cases that I document in the book are so interesting because they're American cases. You don't have them as often. There are many cases that have been reported in other countries, like Thailand's another big one. But on record at the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, they have 2,500 cases of these
That's amazing.
reincarnations. Yeah. 1,400 of them have been solved. And by solved, we mean they've been able to find who the previous person actually was and that it
Hmm.
matches. And 350 of them, the previous personality was a stranger to the family, which is makes it more evidential. There's some cases in which the previous personality turns out to be a relative, like a grandfather, and there's some
Hmm.
cases in America like that, or they might be somebody who lives in the next village, who it might be somebody who only died a few years ago. And even though the cases are very substantial, you can always argue, well, if it's a relative, maybe the child heard something around him, or they're not quite as strong. But when you have cases in which there's no connection at all between the previous personality and the current family, they're like for James, and also for James, there was such a huge distance of time. The previous death
Right.
was within 45, and James is now 18, so it was a long time ago. And a lot of these other cases too, in Asian countries, there might only be a couple of years between the death of the previous person and the rebirth of the next person. And so that also makes these two American cases even stronger, is that long time period between the the birth of the second of the child and the memory of the person that died before.
Hmm.
So, but so 350 cases like that is pretty strong.
That's amazing. Now, since you've written the book, have you been contacted by anyone in regards to like a new case?
Of a child reincarnation
Yeah.
case? No. But I would hope that if there was one, they would go to Jim Tucker rather than to me.
Hmm.
And Jim is featured in my book as the expert on these cases. So I'm hoping he'll get some new cases, and then I'll learn about them from him.
Right.
But if anybody does know of any cases, I hope they will contact me on my Facebook page,
Yes. Yes.
because I'd love to know. And I think one of the important things is for parents to realize that if their children are talking about past life memories or something that they think might be that, it's fine to just ask them about it, or not tell them that they're fantasizing, but just let it evolve naturally and see what comes out of it. I think a lot of parents aren't even aware that these things are even possible, so they'll just
Sure.
dismiss it. Yeah.
I think like if it happened to me, like I had a child that started babbling things like that, I think it would be kind of scary. I think I'd be a little bit afraid of it because
Well,
it
it
kind
was
of
for them. Yeah,
rocks the world really that you're used to.
totally.
Yeah.
And it's frightening when your child is having nightmares,
Yeah.
repeated nightmares, and you can't stop them and you don't understand why. I mean,
And
it was very, very frightening for the parents.
and a lot of the cases of children having these experiences are having nightmares.
A lot of them are. I mean, certainly the two cases that I deal with in my book, they did. I
Hmm.
don't think it's probably not true every time, but there's usually very strong memories of the previous death, and it usually is a sort of what we call an unnatural death. The person died young, the person died violently, like in a crime or in a battle at war or something like that. The majority of the cases are involve deaths like that, which I think is sort of interesting. It's almost as if you might imagine that there's something unfinished for them.
Hmm.
Their life was cut short, and it was cut short very violently in a lot of cases, like it was for James. So that's one theory, anyway, that maybe something is carrying over because it's not finished for them. But that's just a theory. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Some of the things I've heard about people talk in the past regarding reincarnation, I've always thought were kind of bogus because they were always someone famous, like, Napoleon the Third or, someone like that. It's not just like the person, in the stall in the barn or something. They always have to be someone really famous or noted. That's when I always think, that doesn't
Oh, I
really,
know. I agree. And those are usually adults, too.
yeah,
I mean, the cases that are the most evidential for this are these young children who have not been exposed to any of it. They don't even have a concept of what death is.
right.
I mean, you think about it. How old were you when you learned that we die? And here you have a 2-year-old talking about being shot down in an airplane
Yeah.
with a complete concept of what death is, and he's never been told about it. So, compare that and then being able to coming out with very, very specific facts that can later be verified. I mean, you compare that to a case of an adult saying they were Napoleon or Joan of Arc or something. It just, there's no comparison in terms of the evidence.
Right. As far as I'm concerned, that particular case must be one of the strongest cases out there on record. Would you
I
say
think
that?
it is, and it's sort of an irony that it happens to be in America
Yeah.
when most of the cases are not in America, but it is interesting. And the other case I write about of Ryan Hammonds is also very, very strong, another American case. So they are really, really extraordinary cases. Yeah.
Now I want to move on and talk about what I think is a very, very interesting topic, and that's the near-death experiences. I've heard of those for years and years, never firsthand or anything like that, or not, never. I've never actually spoken to anyone that's actually had one, but I've read a lot about it over the years, and it's fascinated me a lot. And the chapter you have called "Shoe on the Ledge" about the migrant worker named Maria. Can you tell the audience about that? That is a fascinating story.
Sure. And just to make the distinction between veridical out of body experiences and near death experiences, two different things. And so this story, that one you mentioned, is about an out of body experience, really. I mean, if you want me to explain the difference, I can. Or do you want me to just tell
Yeah,
the
yeah,
story?
no. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah, because what we call veridical OBEs, veridical means they're evidential. The person goes out of their body when they don't, when they're like, let's say, having a heart attack or something. And they're out, they're unconscious, no brain function. They leave their bodies and they're able to report afterwards specific things that they saw in the environment or things that they heard that can be verified. So that's, otherwise you have no way of knowing if they were really out of their bodies, but they're able to say in the next room, I heard so and so say this, and that turns out to be, and it also allows them to correlate it with an actual real time event. So they can know if the person says, I heard the doctor say this at such and such a time, they know that that person actually was unconscious. But a near death experience is when they will actually go out of their bodies and then go into a whole different realm, which is, as far as they're concerned, is like an afterlife realm. And that's a more transformative kind of transcendental experience that's not really veridical, but so that's what's different about them.
Hmm.
And near death experiences, of course, have a lot of common elements that people report from all over the world. But this case of the shoe on the ledge is so evidential as a out of body experience that I think it shows that consciousness can exist independently of the body, unless you want to argue that this woman was still in her body somehow. But what happened was there was a patient in a hospital in Seattle, and her name was Maria. She went into severe cardiac arrest, and everybody was rushed in, and she was unconscious, and they were trying to resuscitate her. And when she came back, she told the social worker there, who wrote the chapter about this, whose name was Kimberly, that when she was unconscious and dead, basically clinically dead in that operating room, a resuscitation room, she had left her body. She'd gone to the outside of the hospital, which was a massive building. And outside of one of the windows in that hospital, from the outside, she saw a tennis shoe sitting out there on the ledge of the window. She wanted Kimberly to go find that shoe. She was really agitated. She wanted to prove that she had actually been out of her body and seen it. And so Kimberly went through all the rooms. There's a huge place. She couldn't even go from the outside to see it because it was too big. So to make a long story short, she went into every room, looked through the windows. She eventually found a window, looked out, and there was this tennis shoe sitting there. And what was amazing was that some of the details that Maria had described to her about the shoe were only visible from the perspective of being outside the window. So when Kimberly looked out the window and saw the shoe, she couldn't even see. It was a scuff mark and something about the way the shoelace was tucked under the shoe. So she took the shoe and she showed it to Maria. But basically, that's what's one of the things extraordinary about it is that she was describing it from a visual perspective outside the building. And so how did she know that tennis shoe was there? And all she covers in her chapter all the arguments people might raise. Oh, somebody told her about it, or she had visitors there, or they set it up. I mean, all of those things have been addressed in this case. And, it basically suggests that consciousness can function independently of the body, which is what most of the out-of-body experiences tell us. And so it's very strong because she had the evidence of having been out. Either that or she had some
Amazing.
kind of psychic perception from her unconscious state, some kind of clairvoyant ability while unconscious to perceive this thing at a distance without leaving her body. I mean,
But she also saw the doctor kick the paper from the one of the machines, making I guess it was maybe a heartbeat monitor or something. He kicked the paper
right.
underneath the unit, and she saw that and reported that, which is, just so many different things.
Exactly. She reported other things too, and things she couldn't have seen possibly from her prone position in that bed. And she had no brain function or heart function or anything during that time. So that's just it's a really fascinating story of someone who apparently left her body. And the point is, it doesn't prove that we survive death, but it certainly highly suggests that if consciousness can function independently of the body, and there are so many reasons that we have to believe that it can, that certainly opens up the door for the possibility that at the end of life, when we leave or drop our bodies, that perhaps consciousness continues then also. I mean, it just opens the door to that possibility, you know.
Yes, yeah. And there were some studying cases too. I remember reading that in your book about out of so many cases, there was a percentage, and it was like scaled down to how many people out of this many people had the experience while they were in a death state, so to speak. And
Yeah,
if
I think maybe it was around 25%, right? As I
something like
recall,
that, yeah.
near-death experiences. And the near-death experiences, of course, are way more intense, where the person actually journeys to some kind of other realm. And they, I mean, everybody's familiar with that. I didn't spend too much time in my book on NDEs just because I think so many people are familiar with them already. But I did focus on one case of Pam Reynolds, which is a really famous case, and I let her tell her own story. But basically, they feel like they're in the afterlife realm, and there's all these qualities that they experience in that realm, which are fairly consistent. And light and seeing dead people, dead relatives, and usually they don't want to come back because it's so wonderful. That seems very
Yes.
consistent, and they're told they have to go back for whatever reasons, and they do come back. But the people that have that experience, Martin, are never afraid of death. I mean, it's
Yeah.
absolutely transformative for people.
That's
Absolutely transformative. Yeah.
Now I watched you and I talked just before we started here, and I told you I just watched this movie called Discovery with Robert Redford, and you said, "Oh, you may not want to watch it. It didn't sound very interesting." But I wanted to tell you what I think is it totally wouldn't happen, and just get your opinion on it. And that is
Sure.
basically, spoiler alert out there. Anyone that wants to watch this on Netflix is. He discovers a way to actually prove scientifically that there is life after death. It's recorded, and of course, this is all fictional. But what happens in the movie is that millions of people around the world, once this is actually scientific fact that there's an afterlife, they start killing themselves because they said, "Okay, I'm done with this world. I'm going on
Right.
to the next." I don't think that would happen at all. I thought that was a really weak point in the film because I think who wants to check into the next life if there is one? I mean,
Yeah. Why
it
do it
just
any sooner than you're going to get there eventually?
yeah,
And most people have ties here. They have children, they have families, they have creative projects that they want to finish. They have all kinds of things there. And if there is a life after death, then you would have to argue too that we're here for a reason.
yeah,
And so no, I mean it seems to me like a totally kind of creepy science fiction theme, that I don't think is realistic either.
yeah,
I haven't seen the movie, but from what I've heard, I don't really want to see it.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I
But it
thought
would be
that part
cool
was
if science could prove it. I think that would be pretty
yeah. There
exciting.
was some type of device, and it was actually recording what people were seeing, and all this
Mm.
stuff. And it was parts of it were good, but yeah, that was a little off, I think, as far as
Yeah,
what people would actually do. Yeah, if
yeah, I think so. It's just science fiction.
yeah, but if this became science reality, I wonder how it would change people's lives. I think what you just mentioned a minute ago, that maybe people wouldn't be scared of dying. I think that's probably that could hold some weight.
Yeah, and I think they also might not feel quite as devastated when someone close to them dies. I mean, certainly you're going to grieve and you're going to miss that person, but if you feel that they are not fully dead, I mean, some part of them is going to continue, and that perhaps you might even see them again when it's your turn.
Yeah.
It just has a very comforting effect on people, and I think it could even make people live more positive lives. I don't know.
Okay.
I
Now
don't know.
I've got a question here coming from left field for you.
Okay.
All right. I lost my both parents, and it was very hard, but it was normal. I mean, they were, it was time for them. I lost my sister when she was young. That was really, really hard. I lost my dog last August, and I was absolutely crushed. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I was just so close to this dog. And then I start to think, does it end with just us? I mean, is it because we're intelligent that if there is an afterlife, only intelligence gets that afterlife? Or do people ever talk about the idea of possibly, animals, and then where does it stop from there? How far down does it go to insects? I mean,
Good question.
yeah,
I mean, I can tell you that, and again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily factual, or I'm not saying it's even anything I necessarily believe, but I can tell you that many mediums who I've talked to have talked about animals. Sometimes they'll do readings for people and they'll say, oh, there's a white dog here, a little white dog or something like that, which corresponds to the animal that the person had lost. So, in terms of mediumship readings, I don't think there's any doubt from their perspective that the animals are also in some kind of afterlife.
yeah.
So maybe you're going to be reunited with your dog, Martin.
I hope so.
I mean, I don't know any more about that than anybody else. All I can tell you is that I have heard that referenced to by people a lot.
That's
and I also know how devastating it can be to lose a dog. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. It's strange. It's like you would think that parents or something like that would be harder, but this was really, I've told that to a few people and they kind of roll their eyes, like how difficult it was for me, but I was really, really close.
I understand that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, readings. You had a reading. I thought that was really interesting how you set that up with this woman in Scotland. You did it all kind of under the radar so she wouldn't have any way to know about you. Can you talk about that? That's a fascinating chapter.
Yeah. Because I'm interested, as part of my journey here in exploring these very areas of possible evidence for survival after death, I wanted to test mediumship because everybody goes, most people think mediums are, charlatans or whatever, and probably most of them are. And I was, of course, skeptical about it. So I was referred to this medium in Ireland who works through Skype. And so I set up a reading with her. I gave her a fake name, used a different email address, took out a whole new email address account just with a different name. She didn't have my phone number. She didn't have my Skype address. She had nothing. She didn't even know where on the planet I lived, and she didn't have my name. So there's absolutely no way she could find out anything about me beforehand.
Can I just interrupt you just for this?
Yeah.
Was there any possible way that the person that referred you would have contacted her and said?
Absolutely not.
No.
No.
Okay.
No, because of the integrity of that person.
Okay.
I mean, I'm absolutely 100% certain of that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't even, I don't think it would even occur to them to do that, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. But they have integrity. So anyway, when we did the reading, I called her on my Skype, and the point about it was that she was just so accurate in terms of what came through, and the two people that I had been close to who had died, both seemed to have come through, and she was just point after point after point that was very specific and very accurate, sort of like the kinds of things James Leininger was saying, very specific things, and the personality of the people also seemed to come through.
Wow.
So it's just a very startling experience to have that. I mean, my jaw is just dropping open sitting there. And I was, just listening to everything that she said that was so accurate. And in the book, I go into it in detail and I list everything she said. I mean, people can decide for themselves, but a lot of it was extremely specific.
Now, that must have been very emotional. Yeah. Very emotional for you.
Well, it was, I'd already had one other reading before this. That one was a little more emotional because it was my first one, but this one, I think it was more just awestruck than anything else. I mean, it was very wonderful and very awesome, and you just kind of can't understand how it can happen. But it wasn't really that emotional. It was, except in a very positive way. And then I taped it. So then afterwards I was able to go through and analyze the whole thing. So, because I have everything on tape that she said, it's also a record that she actually did say what I'm saying she said. Everything that I report in the book is 100% accurate and there's no exaggeration. So I just was really lucky to have found two mediums that were able to give very, very high level and accurate readings, which you don't always get when you go to a medium.
Now,
but
how does someone like that know they have that gift? I mean, do you know how someone discovers that?
Well, the two mediums that I worked with both were born with this. I mean, they grew up with clairvoyant abilities and they would see, like in the movie, I See Dead People, I I mean, they grew up having these kinds of experiences, and they thought it was natural until they became old enough to know that it wasn't, that they were different. So they don't even really know how it happened. They don't even really know how they do what they do. It's just a very kind of inborn talent that they have,
Uh-huh.
and that they developed over. And they've both been doing it for over 20 years, very successfully. So,
Wow. Um, I've actually met a woman, a little tiny French woman, French Canadian woman that had this healing gift, and I thought it was BS. I just didn't believe in it.
mhm.
And until I had chronic back pain for 5 years, and in 2 seconds, she completely healed that. I've never had it again. And
Oh, that's great.
I asked her, how does she do it? How do you do it? And she said, I have no idea. And
Yeah.
the thing of it is that um, it was like people went to her and someone kept saying, go to her, go to her. So I did. And people were like falling on the floor, and I started laughing. I said, I want to get out of here. This is ridiculous. And so the girl I was with just pushed me. She said, just go up there, go up there. And if you gave me a check for $10,000 right then and said, don't fall down, I couldn't have done it. I like rolled
You mean
over on my
after
back.
she heals you, you just
Yes.
fall down
I just
because the
had
energy's so strong?
I had nothing, no power in my legs at all to stand up. And I was laughing at the people that
Wow.
was doing it before.
Oh, that's amazing. I've never heard of such a thing. Well, that's
Yeah,
fantastic. I'm glad you don't have your back pain
I
anymore.
know. And it was really bad. It was keeping me up every night and all that. There's a gentleman who wants me to say his name, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right. John Weisskopf.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. He's saying hi.
Hi.
And he wants to know if you met Eben Alexander or Brian Weiss.
I haven't met them in person, no, but I've read their works, and I loved Proof of Heaven. I thought it was a great book, but
Uh
I know I haven't met them.
huh. Well, he says hi to you.
Yeah.
Now,
Hi, John.
now, so your personal experience with Bud and your brother actually came through in this reading, and that's kind of encouraging, and it makes me think that I'd love to have a reading. It just seems like it's really fascinating that they can actually pull these topics out that or that actually make sense. And
Yeah, I mean, it feels like they've got the person there, which is what they're saying they have.
yeah,
But, readings, they're not always consistent. I mean, they can be great one day and not so great the next, so it's unpredictable.
yeah,
Because I know some people will tell me, I went to so and so and I had the absolute best reading I could ever want to have in my life. And then somebody else will see that same medium and say the reading was awful. They didn't get anything.
wow, yeah.
So there's a lot of factors that come into play, I think, in terms of what makes it work. But just to warn people about that. But I was extremely fortunate to have these two very powerful ones, and I was
And
able to write about them. So it was perfect.
and can you believe it's on Skype? That is just amazing. That you
Yeah,
don't
I mean, the
have to
first
be
reading I
face
did
to
was on the
face.
phone. She didn't even see me. The second one, I thought about, well, would it be more evidential if we did it on the phone? And she was willing to.
Hmm.
But then I thought, she's used to doing it on Skype. So I might as well I'd rather do it the way she's used to, but it wasn't like she insisted on it. And she never saw me before that. So you have to say, how much can she learn from just looking at somebody? I mean, she knows your race, she knows your sex, but
Yeah,
that's about it.
yeah, yeah.
So,
And so there are some, as far as there's. Did you say certified? Did I hear you say certified? And I think I read that in your book. How does someone get
yeah.
certified? Are
Well,
they tested?
there's two organizations in the United States. One is called Forever Family Foundation, which is on Long Island, and the other one is called Windbridge Institute. It's in Arizona, and they both have very interesting websites if people want to check them out. They both independently run these certification programs for mediums, in which they have to do a whole bunch of readings under controlled conditions and pass various tests in order to become certified. And a small percentage of people pass, maybe 10% or something like that. And they're quite rigorous, particularly the Windbridge one, but they're both pretty rigorous, where you have to, basically you're under controlled conditions and you have to do blind readings with people under controlled conditions. I mean, I could go into a lot more detail, but people can read about those programs at their websites. And the first reading I did was with a medium who was certified through both those programs. That was one of the criteria I had. I wanted to find one that was certified through both. So she was excellent.
I wonder how that works for them. Is it kind of like the thoughts just pop in their mind and they just say them? That type.
Yeah, I
it's
mean, I
nothing
think
you
it's
can force.
different for every medium. Because
Yeah.
I have a chapter in my book where I actually interviewed, after these readings, I interviewed both the mediums and asked them about how they do it,
Hmm.
what the process is like. How did they learn to do this? Did they learn to do it? So I have a whole sort of descriptions that they provide of what the process is for them, and it's different for each of them. So
Yeah.
I think every medium sort of works in their own way. But the crucial, interesting question as it pertains to the question of survival after death, which is what my book is about, is whether the mediums are really getting the information from a deceased person, which is what they are absolutely convinced of, or are they using their own psychic abilities to pick the information up from me, the sitter, telepathically? And that's sort of the question that I have to deal with in the book. And the first medium that I read with Laura Lynn Jackson is very clear about the difference between information that's coming to her psychically and information that's coming to her through what she describes as a discarnate being. So that's a question that has to be explored, because sometimes people will say, well, you could get all this information just telepathically from the sitter. So how do they know that it's coming from a dead person? And that's a legitimate question that we
Right.
have to look at, with respect to mediumship.
Yes. And I do want to talk a little bit about that. Someone wanted to know about astral projection. Is that any part of?
No, I really
No.
don't know anything about it. I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay.
there were so many interesting paranormal kinds of things, and my book is very focused on the question: do we survive death? Is there evidence to suggest that? And so I really tried to stick with information that really had to do with that question.
Hmm.
And so something like astral projection certainly shows that consciousness is more than we understand it to be, but it doesn't really relate to the question of survival past death. So that's why I didn't deal with it, and I don't know anything about it, but I'm sure it's fascinating.
The space apart, like for instance, when you said that the medium it was almost like your brother and Bud were right there, and she was in Scotland, and that's when you kind of say, well, space and time don't really matter to
Right.
this
Well, certainly not
consciousness.
in that realm.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
absolutely not. Absolutely not.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to get into some of the mediumships. And I told you in the beginning, when we first chatted, that I had a little bit of skepticism. And the only reason I did, I wanted to explain it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like yourself, I used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area for 9 years out there. And
Right.
I had a really, really good friend out there. Recently, he's passed away young, actually, with a heart problem. But he was an amazing artist, first of all, and he was an amazing magician like you couldn't believe. He did things that totally defied anything that I could possibly think could be real. And he did this over and over again. I mean, he was just amazing at it. And so I would say to him, that what you just did was absolutely impossible. And he said, no, there's a way I do it. And whether it was, reading taking a coin out of a bucket across the room, holding in your hand, and he'll tell you exactly what it is. I mean, he said there's a way to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes me a little bit skeptical about the seances and the seance rooms. And
Legitimately so. Yeah. I mean, I'm skeptical too.
you know,
Legitimately so. Yeah.
yeah, because I know that a lot of people have been caught, over the years.
Right.
But you actually seem convinced by some of it in this
Some
book.
of it, yeah. I mean, there's some of it where there's so many controls in place that it can't be magic tricks, because I'm sure your friend was not strapped down, tied up, and having somebody holding their hands and their legs when he's doing these tricks,
Yeah,
right?
I was reading that. Yeah, in your
I
book.
mean,
Yeah.
those are like basics. So before any scientist is going to study a physical medium, they are going to have the strictest controls in place like that. And they can, where the medium, first of all, the medium is completely unconscious. Now you could say he could fake that, but he's like asleep and completely his body's totally controlled. So any movement that that medium makes is detected by the scientists who are there. So I mean, yeah, there are definitely physical mediums who have been caught cheating and fooling people, like there are in any area. You know, there's always deceptive people. But what we're in, just like with UFOs, think of all the UFO hoaxes, right?
Right. Yeah.
But what I'm interested in is the ones that aren't that, and there are some that seem to defy any ability to explain them away, and partly because of, I mean, there's ones that I've experienced myself, but prior to talking about that in the book, I describe ones in which they have been studied rigorously by very skeptical scientists who had so much control of the space and of the medium and that there was no way they could explain away what they saw and what happened, and they were very careful about it. So those cases are really interesting to me.
Now, were they in? Now, I may have skimmed across this part of your book. Were they actually in controlled spaces?
Yeah,
And
I mean, for instance, Eusapia Palladino, who's probably one of the most highly studied physical mediums of all time. I mean, the scientists had control of the room. They brought her to their room. They didn't go to her room. And she had nothing to do with anything in the room, except bringing her body in.
wow,
And they take her clothes off, they inspect her, and then they're controlling her the whole time. And there's a light on in the room so they can see everything that happens. And the carefully recording everything that happens. I mean, the people who studied Eusapia, and it's a very famous study that took place in Naples in 1908, incredibly meticulously documented. They were the most skeptical scientists you could imagine. They had already blasted, lots of other mediums that they'd studied, and they were determined to prove that Eusapia Palladino was hoaxing, and they were forced to draw the opposite conclusion. And it's very interesting to read their study because they describe their own process of having to come to terms with the reality of what she was doing, that it was genuine, and they were determined to prove her that it wasn't. So it's really fascinating to read their own reactions to the whole process and all the different sessions they did with her and how they all evolved, and there was absolutely no way they could explain away what happened.
now
So
that
there
just
are cases like that, quite a few
yeah,
of them. Yeah.
and that just makes me wonder why it's not more out in the mainstream. If something like this is actually happening, why more people aren't like addressing it or looking into it further, deeply, and what is actually going on here.
I know. I mean, that's partly why I wanted to write my book, because I want to say to people, like, look at this. But I
Yeah.
think a lot of the physical mediumship studies were done in the early 1920s, 30s. I mean, some people will say, oh, it was so long ago. But if you carefully study the reports, they're just as valid as anything that would be done today. I think also there are less physical mediums now practicing that, number one, that will allow scientists to come in for various reasons. They don't all allow it. And number two, there just aren't as many of them. There just seem to be, there was like how the golden age of UFOs was like the
Yeah.
1960s. There was a golden age for physical mediumship too, and it was in the 20s and the early part of the last century. And there was just a lot of interest in it, a lot of mediums that were working, and a lot of scientists who were taking an interest in it. And it's just, it's not happening like that today. I wish it were, but I don't think there are as many mediums around as there used to be either.
Well, supposedly, let's see, Harry Houdini released a book in 1920 called Miracle Mongers and Their Methods. And he was actually looking to try to find a legitimate medium and was never able to find one. So it's just, I don't, this is just something that someone sent me today, and I looked into it a little bit.
Actually, he's very complicated. I mean, I think he did find a legitimate medium, but he went out of his way to deny that. He was sort of on a mission to debunk all mediums. And that's what he did. But yeah. I'm sure there were many that were legitimately, frauds, but there was one medium that I think he treated incredibly unfairly and was on a mission and did all kinds of sneaky things to try to prove her and it's a very complicated story. We don't have time to go into it.
Wow.
Yeah, but if anybody wants to know more about that, I can tell them about it. But yeah, so he's a complicated character, Houdini.
Uh-huh. Now, when you were writing this book, what would you say was the most fascinating part of the whole entire experience of writing this book?
Boy, that's a big question. I would say a lot of the things that I discovered, the studies that I discovered that I didn't know existed, that would be buried in some book from the 1920s. But this thick, about one medium,
Really? Wow.
incredibly incredible documentation. I'm particularly interested in physical mediumship just because I find it so extraordinary and so mystifying. Um, but my own personal experiences, of course, were very powerful, and I write about those in the book. And not just with mediumship, but also with various communications that I seem to have received from what appeared to be my brother. But the things that I discovered in the research world too that I didn't know were there. I mean, I knew about the child reincarnation cases. I knew something about near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences and consciousness studies and things. But when you get into mediumship, physical mediumship, apparitions, these kinds of things, I don't know. It just all kind of expanded my perceptions of what our world is, and it also opens up me up to the greater sense of mystery that not only with outer space with UFOs, but right here and with our own consciousness and our own physical world. What does it mean? What lies behind it?
Now,
But
can you explain what the drop-in communicator is?
yeah, I mean those are one of the more evidential phenomena that I ran across. Which basically what it means is that in physical mediumship, or it could be a trance medium, but a situation where a medium is completely unconscious and some other entity will take over their bodies and speak through them. Somebody who, normally it's kind of complicated to explain it, but normally a medium will have one, what they call control personality who speaks through them. A drop-in communicator is when suddenly someone speaks through that medium and introduces themselves and has no connection to either the medium or the sitters, because usually there's some connection. There's a reason for a being to come through. It's very hard to explain out of context. But when you have a drop-in communicator, somebody who just arrives in the seance room and gives enough information about themselves with no connection to anybody there, so he's just sort of a mystery person to everybody there, right? And he might give us a bunch of information, and then later on, an investigator is able to go find out that person actually did live. Let's say they died 20 years earlier or something, and that the information that came through was accurate. It's very compelling because there's no reason that the medium would even have to connect with that person,
Yeah.
or that any of the sitters would either, because so and I have two cases of that in my book, and it's sort of hard to talk about it out of context, but I think people, when they read it, will realize that it's one of the more evidential phenomena that take place. It's not that common, but it does happen. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to ask you for your opinion. Where would you think that, say there is life after death and the conscious leaves the body, the material world, is it another plane? Where do they go, and why do they, float for all this time if they do come back?
Gosh, I know. I mean, those are the questions that we all have, Martin.
Yeah.
And as a journalist, I'm just trying to present the evidence that suggests that we even do survive. But the questions of where do we go, what's it like, I don't even deal with those because those are more metaphysical questions that a journalist can't really answer. My sense of, from what I've talked, from the physical medium that I sat with, who I found to be really compelling, just describes it as this sort of like your energy's at a higher vibration, and it's sort of, this is the way he described it, but I don't know anything about this really. But he said, how when you spin like a rope around or something really fast, you can't see it because it's going so fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that sort of like that you're just in a different vibration, and so you can't see, or you don't have a physical body, but you're in some different vibration. And my sense is that it's a reality that sort of exists all around us, that consciousness is all around us. But Martin, I have no idea what the answer to your question is. That's just, there's a lot of places people can go to try to read. You have to decide what you're going to accept and not accept from what various people might tell you about that question. Or you can try to go into your own meditation and see if you can figure out a way to contact that reality yourself or whatever. But, it's not really within the realm of what I'm dealing with in my book.
Do you know anything about these? This is a question. Do you know anything about these ghost boxes that are so popular on YouTube?
No, what are they?
I have no idea. It's just a question that came up in chat.
No.
Yeah.
Sounds like ghost. Oh, somebody was just asking you that?
Yeah, on the chat.
No, I don't. I don't know.
Yeah.
That sounds
Well, speaking of ghosts, I know that's not in your book at all. That's...
Well, there is one chapter about apparitions, actually.
Oh,
yeah.
well, apparitions as ghosts.
Same thing, more or less, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was actually written by Lloyd Auerbach, who's...
Oh, that's right. I did read that, yes.
Yeah, he'd be a great person for you to interview. I have 10 chapters in my book written by other people.
Right.
Sort of like what I did with UFOs, only not as many, but I think it really adds to the book to have these different experts and tell their own stories and speak in their own voices. So one of them was the apparition chapters, because there's so much information about them, and I just didn't know where to go with it. So I thought I'd invite this expert on it to write. And he writes about a really interesting case of an apparition that actually provided information to a human being. A lot of people saw the apparition. It was an old woman, and she would actually wave, and she seemed to interact with this family, and she was able to telepathically provide a lot of information to this child in the family, and then they were later able to find out that it was accurate to the woman who had lived and died in that house.
Wow.
And this was something the family knew nothing about when they bought the house. It was an old house. So, it's those kinds of questions the kind of cases where you can actually verify something like that is highly suggestive that some kind of consciousness, that woman was some form of consciousness that was left over from the physical life that woman led. I mean, it's very hard to understand it any other way. Yeah. And if it was that means that there's some kind of survival. I mean, and
there's people also speculating that these type of things could be going into different into a multiverse, and there's all can make your head hurt to start thinking about some of this stuff.
It can indeed. It can indeed. Yeah. But I think there's so many different there's so many different areas that I've drawn from in the book that I think everybody will find maybe one that feels like, it's like the famous William James quote about the white crow. That you might find one particular element, a bit of evidence that really rings true for you as the reader. And it only takes one to convince a person, just like it only takes one real UFO, one extraterrestrial craft to prove that they're extraterrestrial. If we had it sitting in front of us, it only takes one case that's really convincing to somebody to open up that door to the reality of this possibility. So, and there's so many. I try to bring in, the best from a lot of different areas, and everybody will resonate with different sections in different ways. Also, depending on what their own experiences have been too. So I try to give people a context for their experiences, like you were saying about your dream about your grandmother. When you get to put that in a context of somebody who has studied lots of those kinds of experiences that people have reported, it gives people a sense of feeling supported for their own experience.
Yes.
That it's really valid, a sense of validity about it.
Yeah, I felt better after I told my story.
Yeah. And then when you read the book, you can realize that lots of other people have had the same experiences, and here's what the experts say who have studied them, and nobody's doubting them.
That's right. So I have your book right here. And
okay.
Yes, and thanks so much for being with us tonight. It's a wonderful book. You're a very talented writer. And
thank you, Martin.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable all the way through. And so you can find that on Amazon, and you also want to throw out you have a Facebook page as well, right?
Facebook page, and my website is Surviving Death Kean, so it's .com. The name of the book and my last name, Surviving Death, KEAN.com. And a Facebook page also.
All right. Okay, Leslie, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you real soon.
Thanks, Martin.
All
okay,
right.
Bye.
Take care. Okay, everyone. So that is it for the show tonight. Thanks so much for being in chat and listening live. And next week, I'm pretty excited about next week. It's going to be an on location. It's going to be Sunday evening, or Sunday afternoon, that is, at 2 o'clock. That's Eastern Standard Time. And I'm going to be at Steve Callahan's house. Now, Steve was a lone survivor, the longest lone survivor in a life raft after his boat sank in the middle of the Atlantic. He's got a great story about survival. There's so many different ways that he could have not survived, and yet he made it. He's here to talk about it. And so that will be next Sunday at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Thanks again, everyone, so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
You'll find her in the blue shadows. When the sun is gone, she dances with the moon. I watch her by the fire, coolness of the night. I feel my desire